Hello everyone, tonight we're going to talk about something that's very close to all of us. Sleep, or more precisely, how people in the Middle Ages slept, which, it turns out, was quite strange compared to modern habits. But before we begin, please take a moment to click like if you enjoy this video and subscribe if you want to keep up with content like this. Don't forget to write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Where you are, it's fun to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some calming background noise, and let's begin our journey into the night. The split sleep pattern before electricity or books on sleep hygiene. Medieval people had a sleep rhythm that seems strange to us. They embraced segmented sleep, sleeping in two parts. After the sun went down, most people would rest early for their first sleep. For hours later, they would intentionally wake up and spend 1 to 2 hours on what could be called midnight activities: prayer, reading religious texts, checking the fireplace fire, or even tending to livestock. Interestingly, this wasn't insomnia. It was a normal pattern. Waking up in the middle of the night was considered practical and sometimes social. In fact, this time was often used for intimacy. As the body was rested and the mind was calm, the second sleep would then continue until sunrise. Everyone, from peasants to monks, followed this rhythm. Modern scientists have found that segmented sleep might be more natural for humans, aligning with our circadian rhythm without artificial light. So if you wake up at 2 a.m. one night, don't panic. Just think of it as a medieval person tending the hearth. The change happened during the industrial era. Factories, gas lamps, and an obsession with productivity pushed people to demand an uninterrupted 8 hours of sleep. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night was normal, not a failure. On beds now, let's talk about beds. Nowadays, we obsess over memory foam, thread counts, and that like a cloud feeling. In the Middle Ages, a simple matressa pile of straw was considered quite luxurious. Ordinary peasants slept on straw stuffed into a sack, either on the floor or on wooden planks. Warm, a little. Mosquitoes, fleas, mice, almost certainly. Noble families had more luxurious beds, wooden frames, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and canopies. But for most people, a bed was just a means to survive the cold and stay safe. The sleep cap, the nightcap, was a must-have in the Middle Ages. Its long, often comical shape was designed to keep the head warm because of the cold architecture of the homes: stone walls, thatched roofs, and windows made of thin horn or parchment. The caps were made of wool, linen, or other fabrics. Besides warmth, a sleep cap also indicated social status. Some women covered their heads even while sleeping, signifying modesty or wealth, while men wore them for practicality. In the city, a sleep cap also sent the message: I'm off duty, do not disturb. Sleeping with others today. Sleeping next to a stranger usually only happens on a plane or while camping. In medieval Europe, this was normal. Merchants, pilgrims, or travelers might sleep in an inn with several strangers. Inns functioned like dormitories. Beds were shared. Privacy was minimal, and sleeping quarters were often crowded. Sometimes men and women were separated. Sometimes they weren't. Wealthy people, of course, traveled with an entourage and got their own rooms. Prayer before sleep wasn't just about closing your eyes. In the Middle Ages, sleep was a spiritual act, a preparation for the possibility of dying that very night. Many people said prayers, psalms, and confessions before bed, just in case death came in the night. Children were taught prayers to keep them occupied, and parents emphasized that angels were watching over them, for the devout, monks and nobles completed the final religious service of the day, Compline, before closing their eyes. Dreams were taken seriously. They could be messages from God, angels, demons, or even from relics that had been touched earlier. People wrote down and interpreted their dreams, considered their meaning, and even fasted for the salvation of their soul. Dreaming of fire meant hell, water could mean purification, and other strange dreams were believed to have a moral message. Monks often recorded their dreams and shared them with their spiritual mentors. Dreams also became the subject of literature. Knights met angels or symbolic creatures who delivered lessons in virtue. Dreams, the medieval version of a Netflix series for medieval people. Dreams were their version of Netflix, full of symbolic stories, moral dramas, and almost always with an ambiguous ending. The church was wary. Not all dreams were considered messages from God. Many were believed to be planted by the devil to test or mislead a soul. If you had a strange or inappropriate dream, it was likely that an evil spirit was playing tricks on your. Maybe you just spent too long inhaling smoke from the hearth, sleeping with animals, a survival strategy. Some modern people let their pets sleep in bed for warmth or comfort. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't just a cute hobby, but a real survival strategy. Stone houses were not insulated and full of bone-chilling drafts. Central heating. That was the family pig. In a peasant's home, humans and livestock often slept in the same room, sometimes sharing a pile of straw. Chickens roamed freely, dogs curled up at their feet, and pigs snored near the fireplace. Warm, very. Even a 1-degree temperature increase from a cow in the corner could feel like a miracle in the middle of winter. Winter, wealthy families rarely slept with livestock, although pet dogs were still considered a luxurious accessory and sometimes a prestigious flea carrier. Some castles even had special rooms for animals. The downsides were obvious. Animals are noisy, they walk around on their own, and they don't understand privacy. But for medieval people, it was normal. A kick from a cow at 3 a.m. was just part of the routine. Monastic dorms, lost comforts. If you've ever slept in a cramped hostel, imagine the medieval extreme. A monastic dormitory. Dozens of monks slept in rows like pious sardines. Their beds were just wooden planks. Straw only appeared on special feast days. They slept in their full robes, not out of modesty, but to be ready to wake up at 2 a.m. for prayer. There were no pillows, curtains, or talking. Snoring was allowed, but loud complaints could get you assigned to cleaning the latrine. Sleep here was a spiritual exercise, enduring discomfort to prepare the soul. Waking at 2 a.m. for prayer in a monastery. Waking at 2 a.m. was a strict rule. The bell would ring, and the monks would move silently to the chapel for matins, when even the owls were still lazy. By candlelight and in the cold air, they chanted psalms while fighting off drowsiness. If you fell asleep during prayer, your punishment was to add more prayers. This service could last up to 2 hours. Afterward, some would go back to their second sleep, while stricter orders would begin their work immediately. The goal? To sacrifice comfort and give the quietest moments to God. Sleeping alone, strange and dangerous in the modern world. Sleeping alone is often seen as a luxury or a comfort. In the Middle Ages, it was viewed with suspicion and was dangerous. Without heaters, another person's body was a natural blanket. Children slept with siblings, parents, and even guests. Besides warmth, there was a spiritual reason. Demons were believed to be more active at night. Sleeping alone meant leaving yourself open to temptation or possession. Even monks usually slept communally, and sleeping alone was sometimes used as a punishment. Sleeping semi-upright, for health and soulsome people, especially nobles and the religious, deliberately slept in a semi-upright position. The medical reason: sleeping flat on one's back was considered bad for digestion or the body's humors. The spiritual reason: a flat position was too similar to a dead person, raising fears of being mistaken for having passed away. They piled up pillows or propped their bodies with wooden planks. The most extreme monks slept upright on benches so that dreams wouldn't tempt or disturb their souls. Pests, the real monsters in bed, forget demons or evil spirits. Fleas, bedbugs, and lice were the real enemies. Baths were rare, soap was expensive, and straw mattresses were a paradise for insects. Lice were so common that nobles hired special louse pickers. Bedbugs hid in the cracks of wooden beds and came out at night like mini vampires. Spices or garlic were often sprinkled on beds to scare away insects, though it was more effective at warding off romance than pests. Sleeping in armor nights. Didn't sleep in full armor every night, but during war or a siege, they often slept with parts of their protective gear on. Taking everything off was too risky if the enemy attacked. Helmets and gauntlets might be removed, but the chainmail would stay on. Comfortable? No, it was hot, cold, and noisy. A slight roll could create a clank that woke everyone up. Sleepwalking, a terrifying omen. Sleepwalking was seen as a sign of possession or witchcraft. A person walking unconsciously, staring blankly while muttering Latin, often triggered panic and even exorcisms. Some believed their soul had left and the body was wandering without control. The prevention: prayer, iron amulets, or tying their legs to a chair. The sounds of the night: medieval white noise, sleeping through church bells, storms, crowing roosters, and even the threat of Vikings was a normal part of life. Monastery bells rang all day and night, including at 2 a.m. without soundproof windows. Every thunderclap sounded like a mini-apocalypse. But after working from dawn to dusk with minimal food, the body could still fall asleep. Even in the midst of the Black Death, people still slept, and if they didn't wake up the next day, it was considered a gift. I have translated your provided text into English, maintaining its tone and flow. Here is the final text. Ready for a voiceover? The years after the trials saw Salem slowly return to daily life, but nothing ever truly felt normal. The families of the victims carried an open grief and a hidden anger. The old accusers tried to disappear into the rhythm of planting and harvesting, but whispers followed them like a cold fog. Every toll of the church bell was a morning reminder of when that same sound had called neighbors to watch their friends die. The colonial leaders felt the wound. In 1697, Massachusetts declared a day of fasting and prayer to beg for forgiveness for the late tragedy. Reverend Samuel Sewall, one of the judges who handed down many of the death sentences, stood before his congregation and confessed his guilt, begging for God's mercy. Other officials moved more slowly, with apologies that were more political than sincere. But the public shame never truly faded. Petitions to clear the victims' names trickled in for decades. Families demanded not only the restoration of their honor, but also the return of their seized land and property. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature finally passed a law restoring the rights of the accused and providing modest financial compensation, a few silver pounds, for lives that could never be replaced. It was a clumsy bandage on a deep, permanent scar. The girls who were once afflicted grew up. Some married, some moved far away, and some lived quiet lives on the edge of town. Not one ever received official punishment. Abigail Williams, whose initial screams had fanned the flames of the disaster, disappeared entirely from the historical record. Historians have searched for her and found only silence. Salem itself became a cautionary tale. Preachers and writers invoked it whenever fear began to override reason. Remember Salem became a shorthand for the dangers of letting belief overcome evidence, of letting rumors become law. Centuries later, the name still carries the same wetter reminder that panic can be as deadly as any plague, and that when suspicion takes root, it can grow faster than the truth. Today the town has changed, Tourists walk on streets lined with witch-themed shops, a strange mix of the commercial and the commemorative. But behind the souvenirs and seasonal festivals remains a quieter lesson. Salem's true legacy is not about flying brooms or spells, but the story of ordinary people who let fear turn neighbors into enemies, and the slow though it eventually came acknowledgement of what that fear had destroyed. I have translated your provided text into English. The content is divided into several sections for better readability and flow. Ready for a voiceover. Families were torn apart, reputations destroyed, and innocent lives taken. Now the survivors had to live among the rubble. Neighbors could no longer look each other in the eye. People who once prayed together now testified against one another. Some of the afflicted girls quietly left town. Others faded from the public eye. Few, like Ann Putnam Jr., later expressed remorse. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and publicly apologized for her role in the trials, blaming herself for having been deluded by the devil. But for many, the wound was too deep for words. The trial officials also carried their own burdens. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent figures in the trials, became one of the rare few to admit his wrongdoing in an extraordinary act of repentance. He stood during a 1697 church service as a minister read his confession and prayer for forgiveness. It was a rare moment of public accountability at a time when most people just wanted to forget. But forgetting was not easy. The families of the condemned began to demand compensation. For years, petitions flooded the Massachusetts government, asking for official pardons, the return of property, and recognition that the executed were innocent. Slowly, the government responded. In 1711, the colony passed a law that restored the rights and good names of some of the victims and offered limited financial restitution to their heirs. Still, it was not comprehensive. Some families, like the Corey and Proctor families, were not included at all. Whispers of witchcraft never truly vanished from New England, but in Salem, the shame became part of the town's identity. The village eventually changed its name to Danvers, perhaps to distance itself from its notoriously dark past. The gallows hill was never officially marked, as if the town hoped to bury not only the victims but also the memory of what had happened. But the memory lived in sermons, in stories, in the silence between former friends. Salem wasn't cursed by witches, it was cursed by fear, arrogance, and unchecked power. That curse lasted long after the executions stopped. The Salem witch trials ended more than 3 centuries ago, but their legacy continues to resonate, not just in history books or tourist tours, but in how we understand justice, fear, and the fragility of truth. What happened in 1692 was not just a strange episode of mass hysteria. It was a collapse of logic, compassion, and legal integrity in the face of panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, preachers became executioners simply because it was too easy to believe and too rare to question. A court that was supposed to protect the innocent turned into a tool of oppression. Religion was weaponized. Testimony became theater, and silence meant guilt. One of the most terrifying things about the Salem tragedy is how quickly it happened. Within a matter of months, fear overwhelmed fact. Old grudges, disguised as a spiritual war, turned into death sentences. No real devil was needed. All that was needed was a belief in their existence. But the trials also provided a costly lesson that echoed throughout American society in the years and centuries that followed. The Salem event would often be referenced in debates about due process and civil liberties. The United States Constitution, written nearly a century later, explicitly banned ex post facto laws and bills of attainder measures that had essentially convicted the accused in Salem. The guarantees of the right to legal counsel, the right to confront one's accusers, and the demand for concrete evidence became important principles, partly forged from the ashes of Gallows Hill. In modern times, the phrase witch hunt has become shorthand for political persecution or moral panic, though it's often used without an understanding of the real terror the words represent. The fact is, Salem was not a metaphor. It was a town where people were hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed by a system that was supposed to protect them. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: unchecked fear can become its own tyranny, and when that fear is legitimized by power by a court, a church, or a government, it is almost unstoppable. The Salem witch trials are a cautionary tale, not just about one villager's descent into madness, but about how easily reason collapses when fear is given authority. The gallows may be gone, the courtroom is now silent, but the warning remains. Truth is fragile, justice is not automatic, and history tends to repeat itself if we fail to remember. Fulvia was born around 83 BC into an elite but slightly eccentric family. The Fulvi, an old plebeian house that had long since climbed to the highest ranks of Roman politics. While not one of the oldest patrician clans, the Fulvi had produced consuls, generals, and orators. Their lineage carried both ambition and a taste for chaos. Her father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was better known for his stutter than his political legacy. The nickname Bambalio itself meant stutterer, but Fulvia was no stutterer. She was born to command. From a young age, she was surrounded by the sharp world of Roman power. Senators and generals debated policies in her home. Elections and betrayals were daily news. She saw firsthand how politics was not only played in the forum, but also in marriages, funerals, gossip, and backroom deals. Women in elite Roman households were expected to be quiet partners, graceful, educated, and obedient. Fulvia rejected all of those expectations. She was wealthy, highly educated, and well-connected, and she knew her power. While records of her early life are vague, her later actions suggest a young woman who was astute, politically savvy, and completely fearless. This was not a person who faded into the background. She had a strong personality, a sharp political mind, and was determined to act even in the male-dominated sphere of Roman governance. The era itself was also full of turmoil. The Republic was crumbling. Civil wars, popular revolts, and power struggles between generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were turning Rome into a high-pressure crucible. The old rules were collapsing, and Fulvia grew up right in the middle of that chaos. Rather than being intimidated, Fulvia learned to exploit it. Her youth didn't produce the simple wife that Rome idealized, but a woman who saw politics not as a frightening male world, but as a battlefield to be conquered. She would go on to marry 3 powerful men, each a radical player in Roman history. But Fulvia didn't just marry into power, she commanded armies, led a rebellion, and became the first Roman woman to appear on a coin, not as a goddess, but as herself. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but Fulvia was ready for Rome. Her first marriage to Publius Clodius Pulcher was far from conventional. Clodius was no ordinary Roman noble. He was a populist firebrand, a political incendiary with a gift for creating chaos, scandal, and street power. To many of the Roman elite, he was dangerous. To the masses, he was a hero, and for Fulvia, he was a strategic opportunity. Their marriage, around the early 50s BC, united Fulvia with a man who had made the Roman Republic his personal stage. Clodius was famous for his theatrical defiance. He once disguised himself as a woman to sneak into a women-only religious ceremony at Caesar's Homa, scandalous act that only increased his popularity. He later renounced his patrician status to run for tribune of the plebs, an office that gave him veto power over the Senate. Clodius understood Rome's street politics better than most, and Fulvia, far from being a passive companion, was right by his side. She was no silent partner. Roman sources indicate that Fulvia was an active participant in her husband's political world. She engaged with Claudius's supporters, appeared during his campaigns, and managed their household as a hub of political activity. Together, they became a new kind of power couple, bold, populist, and unabashed. But this alliance came at a high price. In 52 BC, Claudius was assassinated on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annius Milo. The death shook Rome, but Fulvia did not grieve in silence. She staged a political funeral that historians still talk about. She paraded Claudius's mutilated corpse through the Roman Forum, his bloody wounds on display for maximum effect. The public was horrified and enraged. Riots broke out. The Senate house was burned to the ground. Fulvia had turned private grief into public rebellion. It was her first major political act, and it worked. Her ability to manipulate public emotion, use spectacle as strategy, and turn her husband's legacy into a weapon made her a new player on the Roman political stage. Claudius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped out of the shadows, and Rome would never see her the same way again. Fulvia didn't linger in mourning. In Rome, political capital has a short shelf life, and she understood that better than anyone. Not long after Claudius's brutal death, she remarried, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's most ardent supporters. At first glance, Curio seemed an unlikely match. He was known for being flamboyant and dramatic, but beneath his style was a sharp political operator. As a tribune of the plebs in 50 BC, Curio wielded immense influence during the Republic's most critical period, when Rome was teetering between war and peace, between Caesar's ambition and the Senate's resistance. Fulvia saw in Curio not just a husband, but a bridge to the next power block. This was not a romantic escape, but a calculated alliance. With Claudius gone, Fulvia needed a new political anchor, someone who could continue her first husband's populist legacy while having the backing of Caesar. Together, Fulvia and Antony formed one of the most influential couples of the late Roman Republic by the time of her marriage. Fulvia was well acquainted with blood and intrigue. She had already buried 2 husbands and navigated countless political enemies. Antony himself was no stranger to controversy. He was known for his drinking, gambling, and a scandalous private life. But in Fulvia, he found a true partner, not just a consort. Fulvia was able to maintain alliances, mobilize supporters, and defend Antony's interests, even when he was away at war. Antony, despite his frequent recklessness, understood Fulvia's value. She was granted power that almost no Roman woman had ever had before. Fulvia read his letters, issued commands, attended meetings, and influenced official appointments without having to ask for permission. Roman sources, which were mostly hostile to her, depicted Fulvia as ambitious and power-hungry. What truly frightened them was not the ambition itself, but the fact that she acted like a Roman man in a world that had no term for a woman so powerful. After the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, the Republic was shaken once again. Antony moved quickly to secure his position as Caesar's political heir, but it was Fulvia who held the reins of power in Rome. When Antony formed the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia became his representative in the capital, managing patronage networks, leading street gangs, and ensuring Antony's supporters remained solid. She even helped arrange the marriage of her daughter Clodia to Octavian, an alliance that would later crack in public. Fulvia appeared not just as a wife, but as her husband's deputy. Coins were minted with Antony's image and her name, an unprecedented acknowledgement for a Roman woman. She didn't hide in the shadow of power, she stood at its center. But in Rome, power was always fragile, and Fulvia soon tested the limits of how far a woman could go before the city pushed back. While Antony was on a military campaign in the east, Fulvia commanded the streets of Rome. She was more than a wife, she was almost a regent. In an era where violence, bribery, and raw influence were political tools, Fulvia proved she could play the game as well as, if not better than, when any senator. Tensions with Octavian's faction grew higher. Fulvia realized their alliance was cracking and understood something both men had not yet fully grasped. The Republic was not big enough for both of them. She began preparing for the next step, not diplomacy, but confrontation. The Purusini War, Fulvia's last stand-in, 41 BC. Fulvia did the unthinkable. She openly went to war with Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, with her husband still in the east. She, along with Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother and the consul, challenged Octavian's authority in Italy. The official reason: defending Antony's interests and the land rights of loyal veterans. But Fulvia's handprints were everywhere. The Perusian War was triggered by Octavian's land redistribution, which displaced many people to give land to his soldiers. Fulvia exploited the public dissatisfaction, accusing Octavian of being a tyrant and a traitor to Caesar's legacy. With Lucius as the official face in the Senate and Fulvia working behind the scenes, they raised 8 legions and seized the city of Perusia, modern-day Perusia. Ancient sources describe Fulvia as more passionate than Lucius himself, rallying troops, influencing public opinion, and coordinating directly with generals. Octavian moved swiftly. He besieged Perusia throughout the winter of 41 to 40 BC, cutting off supplies and forcing the city to surrender. Fulvia, trapped in starvation and political intrigue, watched her struggle collapse. In early 40 BC, the city fell. Lucius was pardoned to preserve the relationship with Antony, but Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once led riots, arranged political marriages, commanded troops, and even minted coins with her own name was now considered too dangerous. She was sent to Sicilian Greece to potentially meet Antony, but Antony did not meet her immediately. He was instead growing close to Cleopatra in Egypt. The betrayal was both personal and political. Fulvia had fought for Antony's power, only to be left alone. Some historians say Antony was angry that Fulvia had launched a war without his permission. Others suggest her downfall made it easier for Antony to marry Octavia, Octavian's sister, for peace. Fulvia's supporters remained, but her health deteriorated. After a siege, exile, and betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BC, likely from disease, stress, or a broken heart, perhaps all at once. She was around 43 years old. Fulvia's death gave Antony a political exit. He made peace with Octavian and married Octavia as part of the peace treaty. The triumvirate was reunited only because the woman who dared to challenge them was gone. Fulvia's legacy: after her death, the men she had helped began to rewrite her story. Fulvia was made a scapegoat. The cause of the Perusian War, the breakdown of the Antony-Octavian relationship, and even the chaos of the Republic. Historians like Appian, Dio Cassius, and Plutarch painted her as a jealous, power-hungry, and warmongering instigator. In reality, Fulvia was only playing on a political stage that had always considered violence and intrigue normal as long as the perpetrators were men. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian, who would later become Augustus. Her one mistake was that she was a woman acting like a Roman statesman. Even Antony, whose power she had protected, blamed her for political expediency. There were no monuments, no eulogies, only silence. But her influence could not be erased. Fulvia had raised armies, organized elections, negotiated alliances, and even minted coins with her own name on them, not as a goddess, but as a true political figure. Though slandered, her name remains in the records. Fulvia is not a historical footnote. She was a genuine force. She refused to simply vanish, and her echo can still be heard by anyone willing to listen to the story told by the men. The Road to America, 1963. In the summer of 1963, the United States was at a crossroads of two worlds. One, a legacy of centuries of oppression, and the other, a surge for freedom. In the South, segregation was not just a social norm but the law. Black people were forbidden from entering restaurants, schools, buses, voting booths, and even public water fountains. Police brutality was rampant. Lynchings occurred, and in Birmingham, peaceful demonstrators were attacked by police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. Change was coming. Without waiting for permission, the civil rights movement was entering the national stage. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis became symbols of resistance. The idea of a large march on Washington, D.C. had actually been around since the 1940s. Philip Randolph had proposed it to pressure Roosevelt into desegregating the defense industry. At that time, the protest was called off in exchange for an executive order. But in 1963, the stakes were higher. Randolph, Bayard, Rustin, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. revived the idea, demanding dignity, voting rights, school desegregation, equal pay, and the right to live without fear. More than a dozen civil rights organizations, despite their differing strategies, came together. Buses were coordinated, leaflets were distributed, and the word spread. The entire nation prepared to head to the Capitol. Organizing a protest for over 100,000 people seemed impossible. Food, water, transportation, a sound system, restrooms, medical teams, permits, security, but Bayard, Rustin, the chief organizer, handled everything with extraordinary discipline. In 8 weeks, the idea was turned into a reality. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the dual message racial justice and economic opportunity was delivered simultaneously. The federal government was anxious. President John F. But he was not given a microphone. Behind the powerful image of the march was a more complex reality. The movement was still grappling with its own internal hierarchies and blind spots. Even among the 6 major organizations, friction existed. SNCC leaders were increasingly disillusioned by the slow pace of change and the older generation's emphasis on moderation. They wanted to confront systemic racism more aggressively. CORE had similar frustrations, but unity was considered too important to sacrifice at least for that one day. Meanwhile, the federal government watched anxiously. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, assigned more than 100 agents to monitor the organizers. They tapped hotel rooms, followed key figures, and compiled dossiers. They were convinced the march would turn violent or be taken over by communists. When it didn't, they intensified their surveillance, particularly on Dr. King. And let's not forget the cost. The march cost over $250,000, equivalent to millions of dollars today. Most of the funds were raised through labor unions and sympathetic philanthropists, but organizers were scrambling until the last minute. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic, but it was also deeply human, imperfect, messy, political, and unfinished, just like the nation itself. It was an attempt at healing. The sun began to set behind the Washington Monument as the crowd slowly dispersed. People hugged, cried, sang, and simply lingered on ground that felt sacred. But the march was over. The speeches had been delivered, the signs had been held high, and the world had watched, and a question hung in the hot August air. What happens now? The aftermath in the days that followed, the media reaction was largely positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the event's significance, though often with a cool, detached tone. Many described it as orderly and dignified a code, for there were no riots. Few highlighted the march's specific demands, like a federal jobs program or a minimum wage equivalent to around $20 today. But Dr. King's speech could not be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the march, watched it on television with admiration and perhaps astonishment. He called the event impressive and immediately met with civil rights leaders at the White House. But legislative progress remained slow. The proposed civil rights bill was still stalled in Congress due to opposition from southern states. Some activists were disappointed. They had hoped the march would result in immediate action. Instead, they returned to the daily grind, organizing, demonstrating, fighting, and mourning those who had paid the price for justice. Just weeks later, that harsh reality struck. On September 15, 1963, 4 young black girls were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The dream had been spoken, but the nightmare was not over. Still, something had changed. The March on Washington marked a new phase of the civil rights movement. It proved that mass protest could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It brought together a broader coalition than ever before. Labor unions, religious leaders, celebrities, students, and working people, all united for justice. Most importantly, it gave the movement a voice, a dream, a speech that would be quoted, studied, and heard around the world. The march was over, but the road was still long, and that road would pass through blood, legislation, and transformation. The March on Washington did not just shake America's conscience, it reshaped its moral landscape. What began as an act of courageous protest became the foundation of the civil rights movement's legacy, changing how America understood justice, democracy, and the power of collective action. A legacy beyond the march. Legislatively, the march did not produce an immediate victory. However, it created momentum. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. This bill prohibited segregation in public places and employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act followed in 1965, dismantling the core of Jim Crow laws. Would those laws have passed without the march? Maybe. But would they have had the same moral pressure and public support? Most likely not. For Martin Luther King Jr., that day's speech elevated him to a new level, from a respected leader to a global icon. But with fame came a price: increased surveillance, threats, and ultimately, his assassination in 1968. The dream he delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial became more poignant, tragic, and revered with each passing year. For the broader movement, the march showed what unity could achieve. It gave organizers a blueprint for large-scale mobilization and inspired a generation of activists in the US and worldwide. Anti-apartheid organizations in South Africa, student demonstrators in Europe, and future human rights leaders all pointed to this march as a model. But the march's legacy is not just historical. Its language, its idea of jobs and freedom, its imagery of peaceful resistance, and the echoes of "I Have a Dream" still resonate in modern protests. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter, the echoes of 1963 are heard in every chant and every sign in Washington. DCA Memorial to King now stands across from the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors pass his towering statue with words from that August day etched into the granite. But the true memorial is not in stone. It is in the classrooms, the voting booths, the marches, and the voices that refuse to be silent, because the dream is not for history books, but for living. The dream, then and now more than 60 years have passed since that day when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museums. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools, his firm, powerful voice echoing as a sacred chant in the national memory. But for many, the question remains, has the dream been realized or merely deferred? In some ways, the progress is undeniable. Legal segregation was dismantled. Voting rights, though now under threat again in some states, were won through blood, marches, and litigation. The presence of black politicians, judges, mayors, and even a two-term president was unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once illegal in many areas, is now protected by federal law. These are real victories won through relentless struggle. However, the march's original demands, often overshadowed by King's speech, are still not fully met. A living wage is still far from reality. Racial disparities in education, housing, employment, and healthcare remain deeply entrenched. Police violence, which fueled many early civil rights actions, continues to ignite anger and protest. The dream of true economic justice, a country where opportunity is not determined by zip code or skin color, is still a distant reality. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter continue this fight. Using the imagery and rhetoric of the 1963 march as both inspiration and a tool for critique, they march in the same cities, chant on the same streets, demanding the same basic human rights, but they do so in a world that has been transformed by social media, surveillance, and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be a conclusion. It was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground that said, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." A declaration, not a resolution. So the dream endures, battered, tested, reinterpreted, but alive. Whether it is deferred, misunderstood, or one day fulfilled is not for the past to decide, but for us. The choices we make, the injustices we fight, and the courage we muster to march again and again until the dream becomes a tangible reality for all.